Welcome into Through the Whistle with Jake Butt and Joshua Perry as part of CHSN. See your guy over there is Jake Butt, played at Michigan. I'm Joshua Perry, played my ball at The Ohio State University. Listen, Jake, it was a really good weekend in college football. Just overall, I think we learned a lot, and it feels like this year, especially with seems like the variability, there is a lot to learn on a week-to-week basis, but it was a lot of fun. What were your just initial thoughts on the weekend?
Man, we've said this every week, right? Like, what a fun year of college football. What makes football great is the uncertainty. What makes the NFL great is anyone can win on any given week. That's true in college football for sure, but typically, Bama isn't losing to Vanderbilt, typically, right? And yet, what we've seen this weekend, Joshua, is a confirmation that we're in a healthy spot of parity. And I look at the way what Indiana did to Nebraska as a perfect example of this is a new era, because there used to be teams could hoard talent. Bama would have multiple 5-stars on their bench. But now the talent's been dispersed. So there's a premium on coaching. There's a premium on teaching, okay? Because of the roster turnover every year, you have to be a great teacher of your systems. You have to be a great coach in the sense of implementing your culture and setting an identity for the team. Signetti checks both boxes. You have to be a great manager, of course. And all that does is lead to results. I look at Brett Bielema as another great example, JP, an awesome win over Michigan. Brett Bielema's been a great coach, but he's never been at a school where they had a resource advantage every single week. You look at Indiana, you look at Illinois as an example to say the cream rises to the top. I've been blown away by the coaching this year that has elevated teams like Indiana and Illinois. And it makes for a great product because it's so uncertain every single week. It's been some great storylines.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about storylines, great products, and even coaching and how it can elevate programs. I would look at that matchup nationally between Texas and Georgia. And we've seen 3 number ones fall. Now, a lot of people ask the question about Kirby Smart. Well, you see now back against the wall, you got to go out and get a big win over number 1 on the road, exactly who he is. But there was a moment in that game. If you're a college football fan, you're very familiar with it. There was a questionable call that went against Texas. And the Texas fans started to throw debris onto the field. Water bottles, beer cans. Somebody even said there was a battery down there, things of that nature, which SEC fans love to bring batteries into games for some reason. We won't have to get into that right now. And the flag essentially was picked up. The call was reversed. And I think there were a lot of fans who looked at that and started saying, how did we get there? Like, did the fans really influence what went on in that situation? It was not a reviewable play, so certainly they couldn't go to replay. Nobody at the conference office in their war room or wherever should have said something about that. And I just wanted to know what your feelings were on what we saw from a behavior and an outcome standpoint.
I love college football because of the passion and the emotions and just the spirit of college football. You can feel it. It's why we love it. Big games, rivalries, a matchup like Texas-Georgia, you get to really feel that at its extreme. This is so far over the line, man. Like, it's inexcusable. And I know we were talking about it. It seems like there's been actions put in place. The students have been identified and had their tickets revoked for the season. I think that's fair action here. The last thing you want when you're talking about batteries, like, you could really hurt somebody. Like, you could genuinely hurt somebody. It's completely unneeded. Boo until you lose your voice. Boo until you lose your voice. Shout, whatever you want up until a certain point, right? There's also a line there. But boo, but throwing things, not great. I'll also say this about the call, because there's 2 ways to look at this. They ultimately got to the right call. Like, yes, it was the right call. The initial call was the wrong call. So you might say they did a good job by getting to the right call. But to your point, this was not a reviewable play. This was shocking that they turned it over. And I say this, be careful what you wish for, because you do not want to have a situation where officials do this on a week-to-week basis. You do not want this to happen every week. It's a whole different can of worms that you open if you give officials the power to change. I understand there's a problem with the initial call, but I'd rather live with officials occasionally missing calls than start to enter an era where officials have the freedom to go all over the place and abandon the rule book.
Yeah, it's a very intriguing thing, and I tend to agree with you there. I'm big on process, right? Like if the process has to be maintained regardless of what the outcome is. And that can lead to bad outcomes at times. And we've seen that. But the idea that you have these rules or you have a certain way that it's supposed to be done, that shouldn't change how you try to get to the right outcome, if that makes sense. So in this situation, as you mentioned, like not a reviewable play, they had time to huddle up. That's kind of my biggest piece of consternation with the debris being on the field, is not how it might have influenced the call necessarily, but it's the idea that I don't think they would have had time to huddle up and have this discussion about picking up a flag had there not been the time to clean up the field and remove the debris. And so you get to that. There are people who believe that the SEC Command Center, and for folks who aren't familiar with this, when the officiating is on a conference by conference basis, essentially. And so each conference has their own command center, and they're allowed to interject typically when it comes to replay review, targeting, things of that nature, and help the officiating process. Who's to say that somebody from the conference office didn't say, hey, we need to make this thing a little bit more interesting for Texas? And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. There are people saying that. I'm not saying that it happened, but there's, it's a more than 0% chance that it could have occurred. People are looking at the ACC as an example, and I know I'm kind of bopping around, but I'm trying to make this picture clear. When Miami played Virginia Tech, there was that play at the end of the game, the Hail Mary that would have won it for Va Tech, and it was called a touchdown on the field. It goes to review. From any of the angles that we could see and any of the angles that it showed on the TV copy of the game, it was really hard to say that there was clear evidence, right, beyond a doubt, that they could overturn the call that was made on the field. But they did, because there were a lot of people that were like, they probably should have never made that call on the field. And I get that. But once you make the call, you have to go through your process, right? Like there was another one in the ACC for Miami when they were playing Cal with the targeting that was extremely questionable. And this is a situation where the command center can get involved and help make a determination on what goes on there. The moral of the story for me is, I think when it comes to officiating, the job is as difficult as can be. One thing that helps us as fans, even when the outcome is bad, is the process, because the process leads to transparency. We can say, well, I hated the call. It was a terrible call, but they were by the book in the way that they got there. And I can live with that. But now when we start going back and forth and we're just making our own determinations, it becomes a little bit of a question here.
Okay. Wonderfully put. And then basically what we're saying here is, in summary, there's a process and a system of rules that you follow. You have to understand in sports, sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. The goal is to be as close to perfect as possible, understanding you'll never be perfect. That was a bad call initially down on the field with the pass interference. When you start to get outside of this process, it becomes subjective. And when things are subjective, and you're allowing potentially someone's personal opinion to dictate these things, that's when you start to enter gray area, and there becomes a ton of danger, because it takes away from everything on the field. Cannot have that. I love what you're saying of stay within this system, this process. That way the game will ultimately decide the outcome to an extent, right? Like that would be a missed call. But generally, we can trust the game because you follow the process. If you start getting outside of that and let someone's subjective opinions decide the outcomes or the calls, that's very, very dangerous.
Yes, the process gives us trust. When you start messing with that, all of a sudden you get the conspiracy theorists. And again, officiating is always going to be a topic of conversation. But I would rather it would be that, oh, they just got the call wrong, instead of, oh, well, they're flip-flopping, and I don't know what that discussion was in the huddle. That's a conversation I struggle to handle.
Our game in 2016, Ohio State versus Michigan, JT was short for, like that one. I thought he was short. Okay, if you ask 100 Michigan fans, they'll say short. 100 Buckeye fans, they'll say he got it.
Yep.
That's a perfect example of, if you allow someone's subjective opinion outside decide that call, what are they influenced by? You don't
Bingo.
know. It's too risky. So you work your process and you make the best call with your given information, period. I was on the wrong side of that, and I'm perfectly okay with it because of the process.
And I think that's where a lot of fans can say, I hate it, but I can live with it because I understand it.
Yes.
Right? Like, I think that's where we need to be as a viewing population. All right. Well, now that we got that out the way, I just wanted to make a comment on that. Hell of a game also. Georgia, they got issues on offense. They got some real problems on offense, but that defense, when it comes to play, man, I don't know if there's one better nationally. Let's get to some of the scores here from the Big Ten, though. Quick recapper on the weekend. So Oregon played on Friday. They were at Purdue. They won that 35-0. Was not a particularly interesting game. You mentioned Indiana and what they did to Nebraska. That was 56-7. Indiana putting up a 50 burger on a team like Nebraska was not something I had on my bingo card.
Nope.
Michigan falls on the road to Illinois 21-7. We're going to discuss both of those teams coming up shortly here. Wisconsin starting to hit their stride. They beat Northwestern 23-3. Defense is looking very good. Offense making improvements. UCLA with their first win in conference as a Big Ten member, 35-32 over Rutgers, a team that we were high on. They're banged up. They've got some issues. I feel bad for my guy, Greg Schiano. We're going to have this conversation about Lincoln Riley and about USC because they found a way in the final minute of the game to lose to Maryland 29-28. It's been a trend. It's a bad deal. They've got some problems. We'll talk about it. And then Michigan State, probably a bit ahead of schedule for what you and I would both believe they would have been at this point in the year. They had a what I would call a big win that was pretty emphatic over Iowa. 32-20 was the final score there. I think it was their best game of the season. But we'll save that because we got to talk about both Michigan State. They've got a big matchup this weekend. But let's just start with the winners here. And one in particular that you and I both love this year is Indiana, is Kurtis Rourke, is Curt Cignetti, is just the way they've built that program this year. Rourke is banged up. He had thumb surgery. They're anticipating he could be back in a couple of weeks. I just want to get your overarching thoughts now that we are here in this moment with them. Is this a team that you think can contend for the Big Ten title?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's zero doubt. And you were earlier on them. I wanted to see them versus Nebraska because Nebraska was by far the best defense they had faced all year. I love Tony White. I love that defensive front. I wanted to see how Indiana would respond. It was like Nebraska wasn't even on the field. Like Indiana was it's so fun to watch them because it looks like Cignetti and his staff in the program, they know exactly where they're going. And they're like a freight train on the way to their destination. Teams just happen to get in their way. Like, boom, they run right over Nebraska. Absolutely insane. Now, the key thing here is down goes Kurtis Rourke, who was probably the Big Ten MVP, the Offensive Player of the Year. Maybe we're going to start talking about him for the Heisman. And their backup, Taven Jackson, comes in. This, to me, highlights it's a microcosm of why Indiana's a great team. Nothing changed. In comes Taven Jackson, and he finishes the day 7 of 8 with 91 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. Unbelievable. He should have been 8 for 8. His receiver dropped the pass on 3rd down, and had he caught it, he would have ran for another 30 yards. The system and the culture and the identity is so strong for the Hoosiers that they did not waver even an inch when their backup came in. That offense, JP, is so multiple. There's Elijah Surratt's their wide receiver 1, but they have 4 or 5 guys, including their tight end, Zach Horton, that can make you pay. They rotate multiple running backs that can make you pay. The offensive line, it's so beautiful because they're 5 individuals playing as one unit consistently, and they strain and they block through the echo of the whistle. Watching Indiana is a coach's dream. Because every coach emphasizes play hard through the whistle, never take a play off, run to the football, wide receivers, block downfield. When you don't have the football, block. They do that every play. It's the best coach team in the conference, blown away when I watch him on film.
I agree with you. Like, and I was saying it even before we saw them against Nebraska. I believe that they were the best coach team in the Big Ten, and this is including all the guys that people love, Dan Lanning and Ryan Day, and some of the developmental coaches that we've talked about, and Brett Bielema, Greg Schiano, and what those guys have been able to do with Les. He has been phenomenal. And you're right, when you flip on the tape, you see every fundamental you'd like to see, all of the effort. You can tell that players are bought in. And I like the fact that they have created an offensive system that doesn't rely on saying the coach knows all of the answers, right? Like the coach is going to be the guy who draws up whatever is the perfect play. They say we're going to run a system where we can highlight our players and we can put defenses in conflict.
Yes.
And we're going to make it so our quarterback can operate in a fashion where he's extremely comfortable. It's not going to be too many reads, right? It's not going to be too many checks at the line of scrimmage. As a matter of fact, most of the work that you're going to do is once the ball is in your hands. Is the linebacker playing the run? Is he playing the pass? Make your decision, and you're going to be right every time if you make the right read. And these are the things that I love, because it tells me that these guys are humble enough as coaches to say that our best path to victory is by putting our players in advantageous situations, not by what I can draw up in my meeting room. And I'm tired of coaches like that. And so all that to say, I'm not sure in terms of win a Big Ten title, because the heavyweights that we see here in the Big Ten are teams that I think can win a national title. And I don't think that Indiana is a national title team right now. But what I do think is they are a team on a given Saturday that can knock off one of the big dogs, because we've seen on any given Saturday this season, the big dogs are vulnerable. And it's a really, really dangerous spot for Indiana to be in when they've got a team like Ohio State, for example, left on their schedule. Like on a given Saturday, you can imagine scenarios now with Indiana upsetting Ohio State that did not exist in our minds before.
Listen, I get it. And I know you said you're not sure because it's subject to change based on what Indiana does when they play some of these teams down the stretch of their. What do they look like versus this weekend with a backup versus Washington or versus Michigan or versus Ohio State? Like that, those will be very revealing. When every team, it's true for their starting quarterback, but especially with the backup quarterback, every team has the goals of let's give him clean pictures.
Yes.
Let's give him pictures so the ball can get out quick. Let's make sure the offense is extremely simple. We don't want him talking too much or thinking too much. And then let's get him easy completions early to build his confidence. Bing, 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 bing.
Right.
Exactly did that against one of the best defenses in the conference. That to me is why I have so much faith in him. It's a modern version of the triple option.
It is. And with Taven Jackson in the game, I do think that it becomes a full triple option. Kurtis Rourke, decent movement skill, not a guy who is really going to light you up with his legs. I think Jackson's a guy who can. And so now not only are you looking at, okay, can we run with the running back here? Are we going to throw it out to whatever our slant or our smoke is, depending on what the look is? But now you have or I can just run it, right? And that's where these offenses become even more dangerous, right? Like there's a thought process in my mind that we could see some really interesting stuff, but it's all very simple. None of it's cute, right? Like none of it's because the coordinator is a genius. Right. It's because it makes sense. It's a math equation, very simple arithmetic, addition, subtraction. Do we have a man up? Are we a man down? Period, point blank, and they keep it rolling. All right, let's get to Go ahead.
What I love, okay, one example is on Taven Jackson's, I believe it was his first touchdown. It was this quick like RPO scheme, and he throws it down into the flat. It was like, a completion behind the line of scrimmage, and the receiver walks in, right? So usually what offensive linemen will say is, oh, he's going to throw the ball quick. They could kind of like take a play off, Their left tackle took Ty Robinson, who is a beast from Nebraska, drove him 6 yards into the end zone and planted him. That's it right there. Like, what is it? That's it. He's getting his players to do that on a play in, play out basis. That to me is rare and why I'm so confident.
These guys got it, man. Like it's been so much fun to watch. And like Curt Cignetti, he tried to tell us before the season even started, man. He knew exactly what he was getting ready to do. All right, let's talk Illinois here. their winners against Michigan, it was interesting to me. It felt like they out Michigan in a way, right? Like just the way that they were able to run the football in that game, had nearly 200 rushing yards, did not throw it particularly well. Yep. What were your takeaways just from the Illinois side of that game?
Well, that's it. Is, they had been reliant heavily on the passing game all season, right? Altmaier and Zariah Franklin and Pat Bryant, they actually weren't really a great running team coming into this. So the fact that they were able to win by running the ball was great. They clearly, it was a coaching masterclass. The fake punt, they saw that on film and they executed and they trusted. That tells me a ton about their coaching staff. Part of the run game, JP, was they found a lot of success with the draw game. And I just think that's a schematic masterclass, knowing Michigan's D-line likes to pass rush and make
those
plays.
Guys like to get after it.
They exposed them. And on the defensive side, this is the key to me, because like when you look at them from a total defense standpoint, I got the numbers pulled up right here. They're 12th in the conference in terms of total defense. When you look at their passing defense ranking, they are 9th in the conference. Rushing defense, they really weren't a great rushing defense. They were 16th in the conference going into this game. So how do they do it? They force a ton of turnovers. 3 turnovers forced in that game. That's the key to this. And at some level, as you know, as a defensive guy, some of the turnovers is luck. Like it's just, sometimes you're in the right place at the right time. But they did a clean peanut punch to pop the ball out versus Tuttle. That hit versus Donovan Edwards was a day one Pee Wee football install, helmet on the football pursuit. That's not like they are creating their own luck defensively. So they're not a dominant defense. They're not going to go out there and just line up toe to toe and dominate football games, but they are opportunistic. And it does become like, this starts to become your identity as the season goes on. You create your own luck and your own magic. If that defense takes the field, they believe they're going to find a way to get a few turnovers. That's what makes them so dangerous.
I'm with you on that. And I really struggle with defenses that live off of turnovers, because I do think there's a lot of luck involved in it. I also think that there are programs that are as good as anybody at emphasizing the football and ways to disrupt the football. And the more opportunities you take to disrupt the football, the better your luck becomes when it comes to turnovers. So it was an interesting thing, because we talked about it on paper. This was a bad matchup, right? And like, I thought it was going to be one of those games where it ended up being close, because I think Michigan just has some fatal flaws. We'll talk about those here a little bit later on. But they would still be able to win the football game because they've got better chess pieces across the board. But Illinois, man, to your point, like, they did the turnover thing. They figured out where they could have success offensively. They stole a possession via special teams. And Brett Bielema, like, is way further along in who he is and how he can coach than Sharon Moore. And I think that does matter in games like this too.
It's going to be, I feel, just to look at the two teams we just talked about, I feel very confident in Indiana, because they've made things look easy all year. It hasn't I can't say the same for Illinois. It's not like it's looked really easy. I mean, Illinois played Nebraska. It certainly didn't look easy, right? But they're finding ways to win. And again, like, there's something to be said about belief in the locker room. Like, that locker room right now, they feel like a team that believes this year can be very special. That goes a really long way. And they got a chance, as we're looking at this, 9 wins, 10 wins, certainly on the table.
No, it's all on the table for them. It's an exciting place for them to be. All right, let's talk about Wisconsin. You were on the call for that game. You've watched them the last few weeks, as a matter of fact. High-level takeaways from what they've done.
They have found their identity. And let's just understand that Purdue's not the best team in the conference. Neither is Northwestern. Rutgers, they're in a slump right now, but that's still a good team, right? And yet, what they've done, and I find this very interesting, because part of the reason they went away from Paul Chryst was because they wanted to modernize their offense. Paul Chryst would get them into 22 personnel. They had fullbacks, they had tight ends. They were going to run the ball, and run the ball again. Really no passing game. So then they go get Phil Longo and they want to implement the air raid system. And yet in year one for Fickell, in the first half of the season, they didn't have an offensive identity. They felt like a program in transition, and you're waiting and you're waiting. And then in the Purdue game, Ches Malusi, their star running back who's dealt with injuries, he decides to step away from the program. He wants to take care of his health. So all of a sudden they take their 20 to 25 carries a game and they give 85% of them to Tawee Walker, 5'9", 220 pounds. And he's running behind an offensive line with two tackles that are 6'7", 6'8", 320 pounds. And great guards like Joe Brunner, 6'5". It's come full circle all the way back around to now they have a completely dominant rushing game. They're getting into these gap schemes, and this small running back is hiding behind the offensive line with patience and then bursting through and breaking a ton of tackles. And their quarterback, Braden Locke, who's by no means the most talented quarterback in the country, he's benefiting from the run game, gets him into RPO and play action, which builds his confidence. And then all of a sudden, this dude takes a three-step drop hitch and guns one down the field. Like, it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The defense as well, night and day. I mean, Jalen Milroe ran all over him. He had 75 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground earlier in the season when they played. They've been dominant. Jack Lausch, Northwestern, he's a dangerous runner. They shut him down. So in a long-winded way, they have found themselves by going back to what Paul Chryst wanted to be from an identity standpoint, running the ball and playing great run defense. They've just modernized it, and it's been to their benefit.
You know, it is interesting, though, because I sat with that staff last year, and I asked Phil Longo, and Luke Fickell is the guy who I played for in college. I know him very well. And I asked those guys straight up. I'm like, you know, is it too far to try to do the air raid thing at a place like Wisconsin? And they made it very clear to me. They said that the system was not necessarily air raid. They wanted to be an air run system. And they wanted it to get back to this place where we're at right now, where they could run the football. But the running lanes weren't just created because you've got those big dudes up front, which they still have, that are mashing guys off the line of scrimmage. They wanted to be able to create run lanes by also using space on the field, the width of the field, to create seams for running backs. And so when you can mold those two things together, which is the big guys, the personality of the program, with a little bit more space, right? Like with the creative use of the field, now you can make some special things happen. And to Braden Locke, just real quick, I spent some time with him last year too. Dude's really sharp. His ball handling and his operation, I think, is really good. Is he like the number one quarterback that you would select if you were just going down the line? Probably not. But there is a reason why he was really productive in big school Texas high school football.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why 2 years in a row now he's been able to step in for Wisconsin, and you're not pointing to him as he's the issue with the offense as a backup quarterback. I've got a lot of respect for the kid because he does exactly what he needs to do to operate within that offense.
You pointed this out last weekend too. So Signetti, there's the camera crew gets shots of coaches, and Indiana's blowing out Nebraska, and Signetti has this disgusted look on his face because he saw something that was below their standard. Last week, Wisconsin, 3 straight wins. They dominate Northwestern on the road, and Brooklyn Fletcher, our excellent sideline reporter, is asking coach like positive questions. That dude is he's not happy. He's not celebrating. He's so focused. He knows they have a long way to go to get there. And like, those are little clues that can help show you and predict the direction of the program. So I found that really interesting, and it'll show up this week versus Penn State.
I know there were people starting to doubt the Luke Fickell experience. He's a guy who's won numerous championships. He's a guy who's coached in championship games a handful of times in his career. He has an idea of what exactly it takes, and the undertaking at Wisconsin, trying to flip, how things have been done. It takes a little while. He's on the right track. Last thing I'll say, Brady Collins, their strength coach, he jumped into Lake Michigan after that game. Brady Collins is my guy. He coached me at Ohio State. We grew up, and I'm not exaggerating, we grew up 2 minutes apart. I've known him from the time that I was in like middle school. One of the all-time guys, but the only reason I bring him up, when you're going through a slump as a program, you got to have a guy like that in your building. Those
Yeah.
players love him. And he said, when we beat Northwestern, I'm jumping in that lake. And the guys are all into that kind of stuff. So they've built it. They've built it well. There's still a ton of work to be done, but I don't think this positive streak that they've been on has been an accident whatsoever. All right, I want to get to some losers here. Okay, real quick before we get into a couple of previews. All right, and we'll start with one of the major losers, your alma mater, the University of Michigan. It doesn't look like what we saw the last 3 years, Jake.
No.
Floor is yours.
You know what they say, it's never as good as it seems, it's never as bad as it seems. I look at the film and I say, man, as deflating emotionally as that loss was for this team, like the film, it's not as bad as it seems. I thought the defense generally, they played a good game. It was great to see Jayshon Barham, their linebacker, played his best game. Been waiting to see that all year. He showed up everywhere. Of course, they made life difficult on Altmaier. The passing defense had struggled, and they're playing an Illinois team that was great at exactly that. And yet they showed up and did well. They were put in bad positions by their special teams and their offense. So let's talk about it. Okay. They have hurt themselves by the quarterback shuffle. At some level, you have to accept that whoever you're going to put in there is going to make mistakes because it's just their early part of their starting career. They have not been afforded the ability to grow through those mistakes because it's Davis Warren for 3 weeks, then he's benched, and then it's Alex Orji, and then he's benched, and now it's Jack Tuttle. We'll see if he gets benched. So they're starting from square one multiple times this season. I don't know. The game plan cannot be to throw it 32 times a game. That I do know. You cannot throw the ball 32 times versus Illinois or versus Michigan State. So this weekend, I believe Khalil Mullings, JP, he's become a star before our eyes. He's their best running back by a landslide. Need to see him have 25 carries this weekend. The offensive line was shocked to see how poor they performed in the early part of the season. Then they shuffled some peoples around. Greg Crippen is their starting center. Their two guards are their two guards, Preeb and El-Hadi. Miles Hinton went down. Evan Link was on the bench. They started Gentry at right tackle. That's settled. He is their right tackle. Miles Hinton's going to come back this week. He's their left tackle. Their offensive line played one of their better games I'd seen this year. Again, that's positive. Certainly a long way to go. And I'll just say this, Joshua. I can't believe I'm saying this. If they want to get to 6 wins, they have to win this weekend. Like, you still play Oregon, Indiana, and Ohio State. What?
Sheesh.
If they want to get to 6 wins, they have got to win this weekend. Everything I just mentioned has to grow. O-line, quarterback, limiting their turnovers, Khalil Mullings, everything has to grow.
All right, let me get you a little pushback here for a sec, though. And I want to make this quick, but how can you say that Michigan played one of their best games defensively when they gave up 5 yards a carry?
Because their passing defense was the weakness. Okay, the passing defense was by far the weak point, and they grew there. Part of that 5 yards a carry includes the carry on special teams too, like a big time explosive run. You also have a few draws in there that were like big chunk yards. So I do think those numbers are skewed a little bit. Generally speaking, though, they to only give up 21 points when you're talking about 3 turnovers and a fake punt, like that to me, with them being in such a bad position, shows signs of growth. Not to the standard, but signs of growth.
It was 4 yards a carry if you take out the
that's much more manageable.
It is manageable. It's just I still think they've got a ways to go. And I'm more shocked by that side of the ball than anything. It's the reason that I ask you that question. Okay, let's do the USC thing. Lincoln Riley, I've been saying it for years, glorified OC. They find a way to just screw it up once again. So they're one of 2 teams in the last 20 years that in their first 7 games have had a fourth quarter lead and have a losing record through 7 games, right? Like that means that they have lost more games in the fourth quarter than they have won. And they've done it in a historic fashion that there's only one other team in the last 20 years who's done the same thing they have. What you got?
This season is it's pretty much over. Okay. Maybe they win some more games. Certainly you'd like to win, but this season, It's so far away from what they want it to be. In my mind, I'm already thinking about what they can do to correct this. So that's going to happen in the offseason. When Jim Harbaugh first got to Michigan, we were coming off a 7-6 year and a 5-7 year, and we lost a ton of close games in that 7-6 year specifically. So Jim Harbaugh came in, and the spring ball was the most physical grind, biggest challenge. I couldn't believe how hard it was, but there was a method to his madness. 4-hour practices. And at the 3-hour mark, maybe 2.5-hour mark, Jim would blow the horn and call the entire team up. And he made this a point a few times. He said, I just want you guys to take a second. You're 2.5 hours into practice right now. I watched every game of your past 2 years. This was the moment where you lost games. You guys did not have the conditioning. You did not have the conditioning to be physical for 4 quarters. He made it a point to say, you guys lost games down the stretch right at this exact moment. And he did it to inspire us to push our bodies and minds to work hard to finish out those 4-hour practices. That's what has to happen with Lincoln Riley, because the way they continue to lose games into the second half and in the fourth quarter, it's at some point it's mental. It's not all skill. It's not all play calling. This has become a mental challenge. So it's going to be on Lincoln Riley to lead his teams. I think he could take a page out of Jim's playbook there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's built for it. Like, you and I have talked about this offline many times, but like Jim Harbaugh and Urban Meyer are not very different in terms of program building. They're tough guys. They're grinders. They're honest almost to a fault. And it's difficult to be around those guys. It's difficult to be a part of their programs. But the way that it was built was very much from an old school standpoint. And there's not anything to indicate to me that Lincoln Riley is the guy who's just going to be able to flip that switch. It took him forever to make the move to hire a new defensive coordinator. And I think he made the right hire. But we were also sold this idea that if they can just get to middle tier in college football defensively, that they're a surefire playoff team because the offense is CFP offense. Then we start to realize they actually got holes on their offensive front. And when they don't have a Heisman winning quarterback, it's a completely different exercise when it comes to USC. I've lost faith. I've talked to folks out there who are tied in with that university. They're losing faith. And I do think we're pulling up on scary hours here for Lincoln Riley out there on the West Coast. The conference record is abysmal. It's bad. And the only thing I think that they're really holding on to was one of those games in the fourth quarter that they did win. It was the first one that we watched them play in this year. But outside of that, hasn't really been all that impressive for me.
So you said you don't know if he's built for it. And I think that's fair. How could we know? We don't know.
But you think you would have found out by now? He's been a head coach for a long time. We got to find these things out at some point.
Okay. And I'd say
there's not a coach who's won a championship who hasn't built their program in the way that our coaches did.
Exactly.
Maybe Ed Orgeron, but that's an outlier.
Yes, but again, there's this juxtaposition of it. He's responsible for it taking so long to get D'Anton Lynn, but I will give him credit for going to get D'Anton Lynn. You could see the fruits of that labor. Their defense is not an elite defense, but much improved.
I don't think I can give him credit for that, Jake.
I can give him credit for it. I will. The next step is going to be that has not shown he's built for it, but he damn sure has to be this offseason. This has been a wake-up call into Big Ten football. You could say what you want about the programs and the offenses, but guys play hard in the Big Ten. They're conditioned, and the defenses are physical up front. So something has to change. And I just thought that was interesting how Jim kind of emphasized that for our program and how it improved us.
Yeah, I think it's wild. And Jim, I think, had the luxury of being able to press reset in year 4 or 5 or whatever it was with the program. Part of that is because he's a Michigan man, right? He played there. He was a legend there. Lincoln Riley, I don't think he gets the luxury of saying in year 4 he's going to press the reset button on how he chooses to operate a program. And that's what he's going to have to do this offseason if he still remains the coach there. We'll press the reset button in year 4. That is crazy to me. And it's malpractice for a guy who makes $10 million a year to say that I'm going to wait 4 years before I realize that we have fatal flaws in how we've built the thing to press the reset button. $10 million a year for that is nuts. I'd do it for way less.
Yeah, I know you would. And you make some great points. The other challenge is like inherently it's LA, it's California, it's laid back, it's sunny, it's comfortable. So like there's a lot going that are going to make that even more challenging, but I don't see how he wins if he doesn't make those changes.
Yeah, I mean, you know who wasn't laid back in LA? He had some hitters out there, was Pete Carroll.
You're right.
He was not laid back. All right, real quick, because we're coming up against it. We got some big games this weekend. We'll start with Indiana hosting Washington. They got College Game Day going out there. Do you think this is a spot for the Huskies to pull off an upset?
I mean, it could be. I mean, certainly this is when you're most vulnerable. You know, game day's coming to town. Everyone's bought in, right? I think there was a little bit of hesitation. You dominate Nebraska. Now everyone's bought in. So you are vulnerable. If there was ever a coach that's built to handle that vulnerability, it's freaking Curt Cignetti, though. So, though I do think this is an opportunity, if they do it, the number one thing would be the fact that you have Steve Belichick, last name Belichick, getting the chance to scheme versus backup quarterback. But again, the systems in place at Indiana are just built for absolute success. It's hard for me to see that happening.
I don't think there's an upset coming this weekend. I'm all in on Indiana as of right now. All right, let's get to Illinois. They got to take on Oregon. Listen, so Oregon, first time ranked number 1 since 2012. In their first game in 2012, after being ranked number 1, they lost. The last time Illinois played a number 1 team, they ended up pulling off the upset. It was against my Buckeyes in Columbus. Those guys were dancing on the block. Oh, I'll never freaking forget it. Do we get a situation like that this time around?
When you say it like that, I mean, man, maybe, right? Maybe. They have to win the turnover battle, but by 2 or more. I think that's it. I think Illinois has to win the turnover battle by 2 or more. Okay. And I think part of that is going to be on Dylan Gabriel. Like, does Dylan Gabriel play a clean game or not? Right. You know, some of it they need some help from Oregon in this instance. Again, man, Oregon, the way they handled the maturity of going on the road and absolutely clocking Purdue the way they did.
Yep.
Yeah, hard to bet against them too, right?
Yeah, I agree with you there. There are pathways to victory in this one. Like you mentioned it, +2 in turnover margin, I think would make sense. You probably got to steal a possession the way that they did against Michigan, right? And Dylan Gabriel not playing an A+ game would certainly help that. But there is this also in the back of my mind, like Dan Lanning's a guy who makes the most out of his possessions too. Like he's going to go for it on 4th downs. He's going to try to possess it. Those are the key plays for me is when Dan Lanning says, I'm going for it on 4th down. You better make him pay for it. He's got to regret making those types of decisions. All right. Michigan State. We got your boy Paul Bunyan on the line there. This is a huge rivalry. I think there are a lot of stakes here because we're looking at programs, same record. I think Michigan State ahead of schedule. Michigan certainly not feeling great about the product they've had on the field this year. What's going to be the factor in this one?
48 of the last 54 winners have also won the rushing battle. Okay, so like that's the telling stat. Like which team can run the ball, which team can win in the trenches. Turnovers. Both teams, Childs has given the ball away a ton. Last 2 weeks, only 1 turnover. Progress. Now, he had a few more turnover-worthy plays versus Iowa, but okay, progress. Obviously, we know Michigan has turned the ball over. Running the ball, turnovers, and handling the moment. I think that's what's interesting. This is the first time Jonathan Smith will experience Michigan State rivalry. Obviously, this is the first time for Sharon Moore as well. Handling the moment. I think a very underrated piece of this as well is with this being a night game. Sharon Moore, as a head coach, has a duty to his team to make sure they're not mentally or physically exhausted. There's a long day, long lead up that can be exhausting. So for Sharon Moore, he's got to manage his roster to make sure that they're not exhausting themselves throughout the day and prepared to go out and play their best football.
Yeah, and I think for this one too, there was the last time this game was played in the Big House, there was some real bad blood, and I think that and especially now as new coaches, but I think that they should talk about the way that both teams handle this one, make sure that they play the game between the lines. And I know this is one of the chippiest rivalries out there. That's important. All right, final one. You got Wisconsin hosting Penn State. Again, we talked about Wisconsin, the trajectory that they're on. Penn State, one of the top teams in the country right now. What are your thoughts?
This is a big one for James Franklin. Like this is one of those games that, James Franklin, we're looking at you, because this is a big moment. You're going on the road, jump around. Wisconsin's absolutely rolling. There's no room for error here for Penn State. And it's also a big one for Drew Aller as well. On one end, showed a lot, especially with that late game drive to help extend the game versus USC. On another end, a lot of bad turnovers in that game as well. So everyone's got their hands in this one. A lot of responsibility comes with being ranked as high as they are for Penn State. This is one of those games that will say, okay, that ranking's fair and true and Penn State's legit, or we'll continue to have questions.
Yeah, I think for Penn State, this is one of those where it would go a long way for them if they dominate, because I'm the guy. I'm the guy who is the doubter. I don't think they're the number 3 team in the country. Mm-hmm. I cannot get there mentally. And we'll see, right? Like
if
Luke
they
Fickell,
dominate, you'd say you would get there. If they dominate,
I get closer. I don't know if I'd fully be there. Like
okay.
it would be, if they could beat Ohio State, then that would certainly mean that they're one of the top 3 teams in the country, right?
Yes.
Like that's when I'll probably be able to make that decision. But if they can dominate this one, the doubts start to fade away for me. And I think that's big there. And for Wisconsin, defending the home turf, this would be a huge upset if they could pull it off, right? Like this would be a program win for Luke Fickell in the early part of his tenure there as the Wisconsin coach. So I think we've got some pretty big games in the conference this weekend with some awesome stakes. I can't wait to cover it all here and talk about it next week with Jake. You can catch us on the Big College Football Show on CHSN. We're Monday through Thursday. This is a conversation that you get. We're 2 guys who are in the thick of it. We cover this conference in depth, probably as well as anybody. I'd at least like to say that. And we're going to keep it real with you. We tell no lies out here, people. So make sure you tune in for that. But for Jake Butt, I'm Joshua Perry. This was Through the Whistle. We'll catch up with you later.